Hey guys, Frank Spear back with you for another episode of Watch This. And what I want to try to do is summarize the entirety of the Bible in a very short period of time. And we're going to just kind of generalize here, okay? So here's what I think is happening. Genesis chapter 1. I think something is lost in Genesis and it's regained in the book of Revelation. Something is lost, paradise lost in the first book, paradise regained in the last book. Okay? You have the first Adam and you have the last Adam, right? Jesus and Adam, the first covenant man that we see in the Bible. I do not think Genesis chapter 1 is speaking of the creation of the material universe, or the planet Earth. I see Genesis 1 and 2 as being descriptive of an area of land that was devastated, more than likely by war. Compare Jeremiah chapter 4 with Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. We could look at many other passages in the Old Testament that use similar language, but compare those two and I'm prepared to be blown away. Jeremiah chapter 4 and Genesis 1 and 2. So here we have God in Genesis chapter 1 refurbishing, right? That's a better translation than creating, right? We have God refurbishing, putting together again a land that has been devastated by war. That's my take on it after reading through the Bible over and over and over since I'm 16 years old and now I'm 53. Doesn't mean I'm right, but this is my take on it. So God puts a covenant man into the garden. Now, we're not going to go through anything verse by verse here. But if you begin to read the Bible with this perspective that I'm going to lay out for you today, with this perspective in mind, a whole lot of things should begin to click for you. So God puts this covenant man in the garden, this man that he enters into a contract with, a relationship with, a special relationship, as apart from other nations. And it says he formed man from the dust of the ground. You look up that word in Hebrew, dust, it's talking about dry earth, dry, arid, a dry, arid land, which is very much like the land that is without form and void of Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. God takes him out. Here's my take on it. God takes Adam out from this other land and brings him into a land flowing with milk and honey, just like he did with the Israelites. Brings them into the garden, into this paradise, into this holy land, and this covenant setting in which he will have fellowship with his Creator. Then it says, and God breathed into that man the breath of life, and man became a living soul, a living being. I liken this to John chapter 3 and Jesus telling Nicodemus that people must be born again. They must come to life in a spiritual way. Something that Nicodemus, though being a religious ruler in Israel, a teacher of the Israelites and the law and so forth, something he did not have. And so therefore he was not in covenant relationship with God in the way that God desired. But that in order to enter the kingdom of God that was about to come, that Jesus was promising, that Nicodemus would have to become a new man, a spiritual man. And that was done via the Holy Spirit entering him. That harkens back to Adam. God takes Adam from these foreign land, brings him into this promised land, if you will, and he breathes into him the breath of life, and Adam becomes a spiritual man, a covenant man in relationship with God, right? God gave the kings of Israel the Spirit of God in a special way. He gave prophets the Spirit of God in a special way. He gave the Spirit of God to those who built the tabernacle in a special way. He gave this Spirit to Adam in a special way that allowed Adam to fellowship with God in a particular way. Then, so it says, he breathed into man, Adam, the breath of life, and man became a living being in covenant. Then he tells Adam, if you disobey the commandment that I give you, you will die. That is, you will exit this covenant with me. You will lose that covenant relationship that you have with me via the Spirit that I breathed in you. You will apostatize. You will lose the Spirit. You will be out of covenant fellowship with me. So here's Adam, who doesn't have the Spirit. God calls him, like he called Abraham out from Ur of the Chaldees, this particular land, and he says, go to a place that I'll show you, a land, and there we'll start a new covenant together. Same thing's happening in the garden, I believe. And so he takes this man, brings him into the covenant land, breathes into him the Spirit. Adam becomes born again, if you will. He becomes a new covenant man, because God makes a new covenant with him, right? Took him from the dry ground and brought him into the garden, the paradise. And Adam is living this covenant now. But in the day that you transgress my commandment, you'll lose that special covenant relationship, i.e., you'll die. Because Adam didn't die physically, right? We know he lived a long time after that. But what did happen to Adam? He got kicked out of the garden. He lost access to the tree of life. Whatever that was, it was something similar to the breath of life that was breathed in him, right? It was something that enabled him to be in that covenant relationship with God. He lost it when he transgressed. Now he's out of the garden, and he has to be, from that point, he has to be covered by animal skins. So there was an animal sacrifice. And the blood sacrifice system begins after Adam exits covenant relationship with God. He enters into another covenant, right? A curse comes upon him. A curse comes upon him. What does the New Testament call the law? What does the New Testament call that sacrificial system, that old covenant system that all Israel was under? It calls it a curse. They were all under Adam's curse. His progeny, his descendants, from that point on, which later became the nation of Israel, from that point on, were under a new system of animal sacrifice blood that covered over the sins temporarily, that covered over their transgressions, not took them away, but covered over them for all those thousands of years until Messiah came as the last Adam to take that system away, to bring it to an end, and to institute a new kingdom in which those things didn't matter anymore, where the animal sacrifices and the temple system and the priesthood and all of the 613 commandments of the old covenant system, none of that would matter anymore. It would be fulfilled. The time that system lasted would come to an end. And that's what Messiah Jesus came to do. He came to wrap up that system. Now, Adam's out of the garden. He's living in that death. The breath of life was breathed into him. He was eating from the tree of life. He was in that covenant of life. The day that he transgressed that covenant, he apostatized from it. He entered the covenant of death. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul calls that old covenant system the system of death, the ministry of death and condemnation. Those animals, every time they were sacrificed, by the billions of them over those thousands of years that Israel existed under that covenant, those animals represented the individual Israelites themselves. And so rather than God slaughtering them individually, personally, each Israelite, because of their law transgressions, the animals would stand in for them, and their blood would be spilled. And Israel would be covered under that blood until the time that Messiah came and actually removed that system. And a new kingdom would start where none of that was necessary anymore, but that it would return in the new kingdom, the new Jerusalem, the resurrection, the new marriage, the adoption as sons, and all the other metaphors that are used in the New Testament and in the Old as well, to describe that return to whatever covenant Adam had before the garden transgression, where it says God walked with Adam, right? God walked with Adam in the cool of the day in the garden and had simple fellowship by grace and faith. That's the return. So the entirety of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, is the outlining of the return to what was lost in Eden. It's paradise lost and paradise regained. And that's why we see in the book of Revelation, chapter 22, the tree of life returns. The tree of life, where God would breathe into believers this regenerative spirit that would bring them to life spiritually. By simple faith and simple grace, just trusting in God, just believing in God, and walking in fellowship with God. Loving God, loving your neighbor. God, I believe, took this nation of Israel after Adam transgressed in the garden. He took his descendants, his lineage, and he took out a special people as an experiment, if you will. As a test case, right? And said, live under these laws, obey my commands. But they couldn't. They never could. Over and over. The narrative of the Old Testament scriptures is basically the special test case of God, those people, Israel, breaking God's covenant over and over and over and over again. And God punishing them repenting, a remnant of righteous being left who said, God, we want to please you from our hearts. And God said, okay, I'll spare you. God bringing in foreign nations to destroy the Israelites because of their idolatry, their gross immorality. But always a few remained faithful. So he would start over again with them. And then eventually, as those people grew into larger and larger nation, they would sin against God. They would transgress the laws. And all this time, the animal sacrifices were only covering over those transgressions. Until Messiah came and fulfilled that. That's why on the cross, when he died and shed his blood as the last sacrifice for that covenant nation, right? He said, it is finished. I've wrapped it up. I've brought an end to this system. That's over. And there was a 40-year transition period for a faithful remnant to believe that that was true and come out from the old system and be the founding fathers, the remnant, the 144,000, if you will, a representative number of the book of Revelation, chapters 7 and 14, who would become the founding fathers of this new covenant system where there was no longer any Jew, right? The tribe of Judah didn't matter anymore. It didn't matter what tribe you were from. There's no longer any tribal system. There's no Jew. There's no Gentile. Whether you want to believe the Gentiles were non-Israelites or they were the diaspora Israelites, it doesn't matter, because non-Israelites could always enter into covenant with the God of Israel via conversion, becoming proselytes. We see that all throughout the Old Testament scriptures. So all peoples were allowed to worship the God of Israel at all times. But in this new covenant system, those divisions that were made, those distinctions that were made about different people groups, male, female, Jew, Gentile, slave, free, barbarian, Scythian, which were the most primitive of peoples, right? Those distinctions would all be gone. Something new would come. And none of those 613 commandments, no longer would the people have to live under them. No longer would they have to have priests offering sacrifices daily on their behalf while animals represented them by death and the spilling of their blood. Jesus fulfilled that. He said, I came to fulfill the law and the prophets. I'm bringing an end to that whole system. And something new began in AD 70 when the old system was destroyed by the Romans, really by God, using the Romans as his ministers to bring that system to an end. That's the story of the Bible. I don't care if you're reading Genesis, or you're reading Numbers, or you're reading Esther, or you're reading Isaiah, or you're reading Nahum, right? Or you're reading Obadiah or Amos. or you're reading Matthew, or you're reading Acts, or you're reading Timothy, or you're reading Revelation. It's the story of how they got back to the original covenant of life. Well, that's the whole Bible in 15 minutes. As you read through it now, come to it with that perspective in mind, okay? I appreciate you guys. Thank you.